All right, good morning everybody. Welcome to week 3 of Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Once again, thank you for being early birds and starting your day pretty much with what we have to talk about today, which is organizing and managing innovation. From a tactical perspective, it's an important week's content because it's something that you will apply for pretty much all the assessments and projects that you engage in for this semester. But from a strategic perspective, it's very important too, because that's exactly what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about how, from a business innovation perspective, from an organizational perspective, we can actually think of innovation from in a strategic way. All right, we'll delve a little bit more into what is the role of strategy for innovation as we go ahead today. But I want to spend the first couple of minutes doing a quick recap for the benefit of those who probably weren't here yesterday, but also to kind of give you an idea of what's the linkage and what's the context and the flow as we go on from one week to another. So last week, you will remember our focus was on the concept of service innovation, more specifically how the theoretical concept of co-creation really comes to the forefront. We started off by saying that innovating in a manufacturing context is not the same as innovating in services. When we talk about manufacturing, we're talking about manufacturing physical goods that you can touch and feel. And we started off by saying that in innovating and in services is not the same, because services are not the same as manufacturing, and that service is not the same as a physical good or product. These are the 4 characteristics that research shows make services different to physical goods or products. Firstly, services are intangible, so you can't. It's hard to touch. It's hard to feel. It's easier to feel than it is to touch, to be more specific. But more importantly, the inseparability between the production and consumption of services makes it specifically unique, which means that a service, unlike a physical good, which is first manufactured, inventoried, or stockpiled, and then eventually sold to the customer, in the case of services, when you think about it and reflect on any form of service that you might experience, you'd more likely than not realize that the service is actually being produced as you are consuming it. All right, so we talked about a simple example of haircut and being going to a restaurant, for example. Think about how these things can't be produced and stored in advance. So this aspect of service actually makes it pretty variable. The heterogeneity of services means that it tends to vary, which means that the idea of standardizing services and to ensure that the service quality is maintained across every touch point becomes more challenging in a service context. And like we said, you can't really store it. So from a theoretical perspective, we delved into the idea of co-creation, the fact that services tend to be produced and consumed at the same time when the customer is interacting with the business or the producer, means that value is actually created at the point of exchange. So that point of exchange or interaction between the firm and the consumer becomes all that more important. And we actually look at market as an arena where co-creation experiences can be created. So service products and service processes, you start looking at that as a carrier of co-creation experiences. So a quick takeaway from last week. The main focus of the aspect of co-creation is how do firms really jointly innovate with the customer. So it's not just interacting, but co-creating innovations with the customer, with the locus being the customer-firm interaction. The process that we're thinking about here is how can we actually go about creating exemplary experiences where the customer is actively involved in the production of the service and in the creation of value itself. We then went on to briefly think about the idea of open service innovation, coined by Henry Chesbrough, where Henry makes an important point that it's not only the service industry or the service sector where this aspect of co-creation is important, but in fact every manufacturing business also needs to rethink themselves as a service business, and the concept of servitization of manufacturing industries and the sector is become increasingly important. So every business then can and should be thinking about implementing service innovation by collaborating and co-creating with customers. We finished last week with the idea of service dominant logic. So runs in parallel with the idea of co-creation. Clearly, and it's a concept that has been introduced by Steve Vargo and Bob Lush, where the main takeaway of the service dominant logic, it is a new way of thinking about how you can market anything, be it a product or a service. It's just a new way of looking at how business really is conducted. So the key idea is that it is service rather than goods, which is the fundamental unit of business exchange. So it doesn't matter if it's manufacturing or services, but what is important is the exchange of service, which is the application of some competencies by an organization for the benefit of another entity, which is the customer. So every business is a service business. So this is an important table, a useful table for us to start thinking about the shift from a goods dominant logic to a service dominant logic. So think about just looking at some of those words across the left-hand side column and the right-hand side column will give you an idea of how our thinking and practice in businesses have evolved. So the focus no longer is on the goods or the product. Even if you're a product-centric business, your focus is on service. How can you actually serve the customer? So at one point in time when businesses were thinking about how can we differentiate my product through better features and attributes and services, the focus now is in how can we actually solve customer problems, right? What is the solution that we're offering to the customer? At one point in time, the thinking was all about how can we actually just deliver value to the customer. It was a unidirectional focus from the business going into the customer. Now the idea is about co-creating value with the customer. Earlier on, the aspect of supply chain is how value is created, is where there's a manufacturer, there's a supplier, there's a producer or a manufacturer, and there's a customer, and there's sort of like a linear way in which supply chains were looked at. And now the idea is values co-created in networks of multiple actors with active dialogue happening between the two. So we talked about multiple examples. We talked about Starbucks. We talked about BMW last week. We talked about Nike and how all these organizations are beginning to use the idea of co-creation, creation of engagement platforms, more often than not using online technologies to co-create with customers. All right, brings us to the focus of this week. Shifting gears a little bit, we're not going to talk about a particular type or form of innovation. We're going to talk more broadly about how we can think about organizing and managing innovation from a strategic point of view, something that applies to any aspect, any industry, any context or form of innovation. I'm going to start off by asking you guys a question, a real-world question, a challenge, right? So we all know of Kodak. We've surely heard of Kodak, irrespective of where our interest or expertise lies. So it was one of the most powerful companies in the world, but today has a market cap of less than 1 billion, right? So the demise of Kodak has been studied. It's been case studies among the best business schools in the world. So what went wrong? All right, so I'd like to hear from you guys. What do you think went wrong with Kodak? Okay, so let's start by saying which business is Kodak in or was? What do you guys think? What does Kodak do or did? Yep. Who wants to give it a go? Have you heard of Kodak? Have you heard of Kodak? What is Kodak? Yeah, I'm just coming to you. Yeah.
Film disposables.
Film?
Disposables, like not the camera, like the films.
Film, did you say disposable? Okay. Yeah, let's hear from you. You're right.
Didn't they create like a camera within a phone or Apple within the thing, but then they didn't release it because they didn't too scared about what would happen?
Yeah, okay. So what you're really saying is that they are more than the physical film, which is how they started, but what you're actually saying something that many of us probably don't know yet, that they actually thought ahead of that and actually come up with a digital version of the film, but they didn't really succeed as much in it, right? So let's hear from someone else. What else do you know of Kodak? Anything else? Okay, so let's hear from you guys. Why do you think Kodak failed? What went wrong? You actually given us a hint, I mean a start to why Kodak might have failed. But can I hear from someone else? Why do you think Kodak failed? Yeah.
They failed to implement an innovative strategy.
Yeah, they failed to implement and come up with a. So what do you think they should have done? What is the strategy that you have in mind or you're talking about?
Introduce technologies that are more, like you said, with Apple, we should have gone ahead with that. They should have gone ahead with that, and it doesn't matter if you take like a bit of a risk. That's what they were maybe outlined.
Okay, so now let's switch context. So we are now talking about what Kodak could have or should have done to keep up with the competitive scenario, so what was going on around them. Let's hear from you, and yeah, what do you have in mind?
Propose in one of their like think tank things that we should start to think about going digital.
Yeah.
And executives at the time would turn around and be like, no, we're a traditional company. That's why people love us because we're traditional. We stick to film. All these other companies decided was it Olympus that were like actually we're to develop a digital camera, and then they market sharing with Kodak.
Just sat with what they were doing, but doing really well. Okay, so what do you think happened there? So they didn't keep up with the disruptive trends, which is the digital technologies that was beginning to take over the market. Is that's sort of what you're saying? They didn't keep up with the trend.
That and also as well, I think they rest on their laurels that they were basically they were the best in business.
Yeah.
At the same time, the best comes with brutal change.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, great. I think you guys have all touched upon various aspects of sort of unpacking the demise of Kodak, right? So the first explanation is indeed that Kodak suffered from what is known as myopia, which is essentially the fact that they were so blinded by their own success that they didn't see the onslaught of the digital technology, which was going to be the next big thing in the film industry. But actually, that isn't entirely true. Yes, there were elements of it. I mean, there were elements of myopia, there was no doubt about it. But in a certain sense, it's not entirely true because some of you may or may not know, and you actually did brought up that it was Kodak who introduced or invented the digital camera. The first ever digital camera was invented by an employee of Kodak. And there you see him, Steve. Of course, it was a camera that was as big as a toaster. Took about 20 seconds to take one picture. Apparently was not of very high quality. Had to be connected to a TV which was not very easy or simple to use to be able to view the image that you click. So clearly not the most sophisticated digital camera, but was invented by Kodak. So clearly they invented the technology in the first place. And then the next explanation for the demise of Kodak could be that they may have invented it, but they didn't commercialize it. Remember I've been saying about how just having good technology isn't enough, but you need to be able to develop, invest into the technology and be able to commercialize it. And so maybe Kodak didn't do that. But that's not entirely true as well, because they did invest fair bit, millions, in actually coming up with a range of digital cameras. So that's not entirely where they completely failed. But what happened from a customer point of view and the market point of view is that cameras were actually merging with phones, right? And we clearly see, when we think back upon it, that the people, the way consumers were using photos and images and the camera itself was shifting, right? And it was happening as Kodak was needing to do something about it, but they didn't quite do something about it as quickly as they should have. So people were shifting from printing pictures to posting them on social media and using mobile phone apps and so on and so forth. Clearly, this is where Kodak failed. So it's not like they didn't spot the opportunity. It's not like they didn't do anything about it, that it hit them and they didn't expect it. They invented the digital camera, they invested in the technology, but what they didn't keep up with was the evolution that was required to be able to ride that wave. And what the aspect that they completely seemed to miss was the fact that although their main business, the traditional business, was about the actual film, the physical film, that people, that the digital aspect of a film was not something on the side, but that was the main business. It's not entirely true that they didn't spot that either. So in 2001, Kodak actually bought a company called OPhoto, which was an online photo sharing company. All right, and remember, in 2001, Facebook didn't exist. Mark Zuckerberg hadn't written a single code for Facebook at that point in time, and these guys had actually had the foresight to buy and sort of invest into the capability of an online photo sharing system, knowing that we need some capabilities in the online space as well. But where they failed was they used, instead of creating OPhoto into, let's say, a Kodak form of Facebook, where people were going to use that as an online social networking form of sharing photos, what they did was to actually keep focusing on getting people to print the photos, share it, but then eventually print the photos and use it. And that's not what the consumer trend was heading towards. So what they really missed out on, and at that point, and at the same year, I think it was 2001, 2012, when as part of their bankruptcy wave, they kind of had to sell this OPhoto bit of their business for about 25 million or so to Shutterfly. And it was, in fact, the same year and the same month, to be precise, that Facebook invested $1 billion into acquiring Instagram. So you can see how the difference was in how if an organization was able to think ahead and ride the wave, the disruptive wave, they can actually use that as a way to grow and move forward. So that's the story of Kodak. So as many of you had picked it, so there was an aspect of being very good at one aspect of their business, detecting opportunities in a different aspect, but not being able to act quickly enough to capitalize on it. So clearly they failed to ask, what business are we in? So they should have, whether they liked it or not, moved from traditional film being their core business, to online digital being their core business, but they didn't quite do that. And around the same time, when Kodak was #1 in the industry, Fuji Films was a distant second. But however, what Fuji did, and you might know by what we see in the world today, that Fuji was able to completely move, to create a new product line. They they had a joint venture with Xerox and started going more and more into office automation. So you can see many Xerox machines and so on, where Fuji has invested in their sort of had invested into. So they were able to move away from their then core business, which was traditional films, by introducing a different product line and shifting their focus into that. So that is a strategic shift that organizations have to do with time to keep up with trends and different changes in the environment. Kodak failed to keep up with that strategic drift, while Fuji, we could argue, did better than Kodak. All right, so what does this really tell us? That without a strategic approach to organizing and managing innovation, you can expect even the best innovators in the world to fail, right? Successful innovators cannot sustain their performance even if they go about inventing and investing a lot in certain aspects of their technology, if they don't have strategic business models around this, all right? Clearly many examples of such failures. We talked in detail about Kodak, but think of what has happened to Nokia, for example. Think of what has happened to Motorola. Clearly examples of organizations that clearly were great innovators, but just couldn't keep up with the changing times. So the strategy of innovation didn't keep up or link with their overall organizational strategy. Again, a point that you guys made just a while ago. So the takeaway from this is that organizations need a strategic approach to innovation in a way that what they do on a day-to-day basis and the choices that they make toward innovation needs to link with a long-term picture, a long-term thinking of their overall organizational strategy, right? So essentially what that means is that on a day-to-day basis, what forms their innovation system, the projects that they invest their resources and their money into and their competencies into needs to sort of align well with the broader innovation as well as organizational strategy, and that would dictate their processes and the structures to what sort of aspects do they want to think about when it comes to research, what sort of novel ideas and problems they want to try and solve, what sort of new business models do they want to invest into, and which of these projects will get funded, and so on and so forth. All right, so I'm actually trying to make this sort of unpack this whole thing, right? So I want us to start thinking about how we can organize and manage innovation in terms of these three main building blocks, all right? We've sort of broadly talked about strategy, but we're going to delve a little deeper into it. And then that translates into choices about the actual structure as well as processes, the activities that businesses will engage in order to implement their innovative approach. Okay, so these are the building blocks to organize and manage innovation. Again, something that's useful for you to just think about how innovation is being implemented in the real world, and also tactically for you to think about how you can go about your assignments, your projects for this subject itself. So let's delve deeper into strategy, all right? So we want to understand what is strategy. Okay, so clearly the word strategy is something that that you associate with long-term goals and objectives, right? So from a business perspective, a strategic thinking or having an organizational strategy is about determining long-term goals and objectives, all right? And what that translates into are choices about where they allocate their resources. By resource, what are the resources of an organization? What do you guys think? What do we mean by resources for a business? Any thoughts? What might it be? Yeah? The money, financial, yeah? People, yes. What else? Their technology, yes. What else? What else? We want to be very clear when we use these abstract terms, business language, resources, investing into resources. What does that mean for an organization? It's about how they use their money, right? What do they invest their money into? Whether they invested into technology, how they invested into people, how they invested into the way they run their business, which is about their supply chain capabilities, and so on and so forth. So just sort of think about resources in that way. So this way of thinking about strategy is what Chandler came up with way back in the 1960s. And then much later, Michael Porter thought of the main focus of strategy of an organization. It's not just to have long-term goals. It's not just to decide how we're going to invest our resources into achieving those goals, so sort of chalk out a plan, but it's also thinking about the competitive scenario. So who else are we competing with in the industry that we are operating in? So it's about differentiating yourself from the competitors, all right? So the idea is towards building something that's unique to you as an organization. So it's not enough if you just keep allocating resources to what you're already good in, but what you're good in needs to be different to what others are doing in the market as well. So then, the word that you want to actually understand and take away from this is sustainable competitive advantage. Okay, a term that you will hear in any strategy class, and something that when you actually think about what it means, makes a lot of sense. It captures the whole focus and the goal of strategy, right? So strategy is about committing resources, so investing your resources, whether it's money, tangible financial resources, or intangible resources such as people, to the attainment of long-term goals and objectives. But it's also about ensuring that by doing so, you're constantly making sure that you're differentiating your competitive position in the market, right? So this, over the long term, gives you a sustainable competitive advantage, right? So strategy fails if you don't attain sustainable competitive advantage. So if this is an organizational strategy, then innovation strategy is about doing the same thing for your innovative activities, right? So how do you want to innovate? What choices you make? Should we invest into product innovation, process innovation, business model innovation? Should we think about radical innovation, disruptive innovation, or should we just keep it continuous, incremental innovation? So all those strategic choices that we've even talked about until now are choices that an organization need to make. You can't be good at everything. You have to make choices, and choices means there's always trade-offs. So where in the mix you fall is a strategic choice that you make for your innovative strategy, which is part of your innovative strategy, and you make those choices to make sure that in the long term you want to attain sustainable competitive advantage through innovation. Right? So these are the three questions that you want to keep asking yourself when you're thinking about innovation strategy, right? We've already talked about innovation as being sort of balance between creating value for your customers, your stakeholders, and as a business capturing a portion of that value, right? So innovative strategy is really trying to understand in the long term a plan for how will the innovation, or whatever your attempt is, create value for customers, how will the company capture a portion of this value, and what types of innovation will the company use to create and capture value. So it's about making choices about the types of innovation as well as the degree of innovation, and then further down to think about what resources do we need to develop, what competencies and capabilities do we need to develop as an organization in order to make sure that we're able to create and capture that value. We're going to break that down a little bit more, all right? Another way of looking at it, frameworks such as this are useful to really sort of understand the building blocks of innovation strategy, all right? So if you are an organization, this is a fairly practical framework, right? If you're an organization, you want to think about your next innovation strategy. How do we strategically approach innovation? Then every attempt that you make, you want to try and ask yourself these questions. The first thing is it real? right? We say, is it real? It means the first thing you want to do is to make sure that does it have the capability to create value for real customers? Am I solving a real problem for real people, right? At the end of the day, everything that you do is only going to matter if you're actually solving real problems for real people. And thinking of customers as real humans, right? So if you're able to do that, then you're already creating value, right? So all the marketing lingo that we talk about, target markets and customer segments and all that, has to break down to solving real problems, filling real gaps in the market. So once you're sure that the market is real and the product which you've come up with, a new product or service for that matter, is clear and real, then the next step is to think about, can we win, right? So can we win is about thinking about whether it is feasible for you to actually continuously deliver that value to the set of customers and to fulfill those unfulfilled needs that you've identified for those customers. So can you do this? What sort of supply chain resources you need to be able to ensure that you're able to do this on a continuous basis, right? So, and can this product be competitive? Can the company be competitive? So it's about understanding whether there is scope to create value and understanding whether you can continuously keep doing that, because it's not enough if you make one customer happy one time. You've got to be able to have an operational and technical feasibility to be able to do that continuously. The third thing that I want to think about is it worth doing, right? So, which is about the financial viability of your business model. So here we're talking about not just making people happy, making many people happy all the time as customers, but whether we have the business model that's viable, that allows you from an economic perspective to be able to profit. So when you're commercializing a new idea or a product or service, you want to make sure that you are able to have a financial sort of plan to make sure that the business model is viable. So are the forecasted returns greater than costs, for example, right? Does the product or service fit our overall growth strategy? So you're really thinking about the sustainability of the business model. This is perhaps a slightly more useful way to understand the three main factors of an innovation strategy. So we've talked about value creation and value capture a lot. A value creation is really about offering something which fulfills an unfulfilled need. So you're offering something, value to your customer segment, right? And you're solving some real problems for your customers. And value capture, we said, is about how you're able to commercialize this in a profitable way. And value configuration is really about how you're able to do this on a sustainable basis. So how your operational resources and supply chain and activities are able to ensure that you're able to continuously create and capture value in a sustainable way. So we're going to now talk about some strategy frameworks, right? So these are frameworks that are useful in the real world to do this kind of strategic analysis. So clearly, we know now that we need an innovation strategy, an approach to innovation, to make choices about how we want to innovate, what do we want to invest our thinking and resources into. But how do we even make those choices? We've got to be able to understand, scan the environment to understand what's going on out there. So there are two aspects of thinking about doing such a strategic analysis, right? So one is an external analysis and the other is an internal analysis. An external analysis is really about trying to understand the external environment. So you're a business and you want to try and understand what's going on around me. And external could be external and really broad and really far from you, or it could be just your immediate environment. So we break down external analysis into macro environmental analysis and a micro environmental analysis, right? And something that you'll be doing for your projects and your assessments too. So a framework that helps us to do macro environmental analysis is PESTEL framework. So how many of you have heard or used PESTEL framework? It's, yeah. So, so you raised your hand there. Do you want to talk me through what you think PESTEL is or how you've used it? Yeah.
You're just analysing the factors that are influencing the company.
Yeah.
Illustrating factors, so for example, political,
Yeah.
dealing with
Yeah.
political government, breaking laws, that kind of thing. Economic, obviously we're dealing with share prices, economic changes,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And what does S stand for? Social. What might that be? What might that be?
Culture, the trends.
Yeah, exactly. It's about culture, market trends, again, social. We're talking about real people here, so we want to really try and understand what are any sort of consumer behavior is based on the social and cultural factors, the trends of that point at that point in time. What might technological be? So these are trends that change the landscape of the technology. We talked of Kodak. So clearly the change from a film traditional technology to online technology, the digital, is something that happened in their macro environment, in the technological sphere. We'll take another example and break this down, but what might environmental be? What might environmental be?
Greening business.
Sorry?
Greening business.
Yeah, and why might you do that? To respond to needs of protecting the environment. So you can see how there is a driver, there's a force from the environmental side of the macro environment to which you as a business are responding, and legal. So clearly there are regulatory sort of frameworks depending on the context that you're in, national context, and so on and so forth that you need to respond to. So these are sort of the 6 ways of drivers or factors that you want to think about when you're doing a macro environmental analysis. So these are environmental factors which might impact the success or failure of particular strategies. So you need to take account of these when you're building a strategy, a business strategy, or an innovation strategy. Okay? So we're going to let's take the example of Apple, because we're going to use Apple as an example for the next micro-environmental analysis. Let's say you are Apple. What might be some of these sort of forces for Apple? So what might be a political force? That if you're Apple, if you're Steve Jobs, what political aspects do you need to think about? Any thoughts? Yep.
The regulations that could be involved with with mobile data or
Exactly, especially in specific national context. Given that you're a multinational organization, you want to think about what the political sort of factors might play a role to how you can actually going about doing business in that country. In many cases, you'll see that political and legal would go hand in hand. So it's because the frameworks would be similar. The legal frameworks and the regulatory frameworks in a national context would go hand in hand with the political sort of regime in that context. So that sort of covers political and legal. So what might be economic factors for Apple as an organization? What might be the economic macro-environmental forces that you have to think about?
The trade tariffs between China and America?
Yep. Yeah, so in many cases, again, in this case, because it's a multinational organization and there's a lot of trade that you are doing among contexts, so clearly there are economic policies that have an impact on that. Social, what might be a social driver or factor for Apple that they always have to keep a tab of? Thoughts? Who are Apple's customers? Okay, I can see several Mac users here. Why do you use Mac versus Windows? Let's hear from you. Why are you a Mac user? The design, all right? That's a social factor from a customer perspective. So what matters to you? What do you sort of why do you use Apple versus something else? These are, when you actually make it broader, these are socio-cultural reasons to the way you use certain products and services, all right? So then let's quickly think about technological. What might be some of the technological factors for Apple that they have to keep tab of? They are a technology organization, so clearly they need to keep tab of what are some of the technological forces, drivers, trends that are happening within their industry and make sure that they are constantly above and beyond. So that is their differentiator in the market that they compete, all right? So clearly sort of their upgrades, even from one version to another, will be in response to some of the technology changes in the environment. So right, so what might environmental be for Apple? Is that a main force that they need, that they would worry about? Any thoughts? Any thoughts on what environmental concerns might Apple need to consider in the way they do business or operate? Probably the impact that they have, the carbon footprint that they leave, more in terms of who they source, who their suppliers are, and what sort of practices they adopt, and so on and so forth. Let's say there's a semiconductor supplier and they want to think about, so that sort of stuff. So what we take away from this is that there will be an element of pestle forces. So pestle is a framework that you would use to think about, if you're that organization or that industry, what are some of the big forces in my environment that I need to think about. But what also came out from our discussion here today is that not every factor would be as important for a business or an organization or an industry as the other. Again, there are trade-offs and there are strategic choices you need to make. So if you're a technology-based industry and that's your key differentiator, then you have to keep tab of the technological forces. There's no question asked. But if that's not what your key sort of driver is and source of your sustainable competitive advantages, then you probably don't need to. So that's something that you need to bear in mind as well. So don't try to invest as much time into all six if you feel, and if your analysis shows you that it's not as important. So the next level of external analysis is a micro environmental analysis. So here things start, it's not broad drivers in the environment, but something that's a little bit closer to your external environment, which is the industry structure, the industry that you are operating in, right? So here, the most popular tool, framework that you can use is Porter's 5 forces. So Michael Porter came up with this way back in the 80s. Things have changed since, but this is still a useful framework to understand the industry structure where your organization functions in. So it really talks about 5 key industry forces which might impact the structure of your industry, and the main idea is for you to understand how intense is the competitive rivalry in the industry, all right, and that clearly will have an impact on your strategic choices. So let's talk about Apple now. So the 5 forces are the threat of new entry, buyer power, threat of substitution, the power of suppliers in the industry, and all of these 4 forces sort of has an impact on what's in the center, which is the intensity of competition in the industry that you are functioning in. So again, we're going to take Apple, so just to try and apply each of these forces and try and understand what it implies. So let's think about Apple. So can any of you try and tell me what is the threat of new entry for the industry that Apple is functioning in? So the threat of new entry means how easy is it for another Apple to be established tomorrow? So for Apple Apple, it is a threat if there are going to be too many other Apples coming up in the same industry tomorrow, right? So you don't want too many people doing the exact same thing that you are. So tell me, just think about yourself as Apple. What is and the industry that you are in? What is the threat of new entry, or what is the threat that tomorrow there's another big Apple in the same industry? What do you think? Is it high or is it low? Is it easy for another Apple to come out?
Not really.
Not really? Why?
Because Apple nowadays is one of the biggest companies in technology, communication, computers, phones. So for another company to rise up, it's going to take some time.
So what is the core competence that Apple has built over time? Clearly the technology, it's a high investment. So the investment that's needed to build the technological competence is very high. The amount of investment that goes into R&D and all that, it's not something that you can do tomorrow, right? So it's going to take time. What else? The brand. Right, so you build brand over time. And it's the same even if you're not an Apple. Whatever it is that you do in the industry that Apple is in, which is make computers, make smartphones, and so on and so forth, it's very technology heavy and it's very technology centric. So it takes time. So the threat that tomorrow there'll be another Apple or Apple type of organization is relatively low. So the threat of new entry into the market for incumbents such as Apple is relatively low. So let's think about the threat of substitution. What is the threat of substitution? So remember, substitution is not the same as a rival or a competitor. So this is not another Apple. It's about what else can you do as a customer or a consumer that you're able to do with an Apple. So let's make it simpler. Let's talk of the iPhone now. All right. So what do you use an iPhone for? Make phone calls, right? So what is the substitute for making phone calls? How else might you be able to make phone calls? Use a landline? So do you think that the threat of substitute of some of you using, let's say, a landline or Skype is as high for iPhone if you were Apple? Probably not. Right? So the idea is to think about substitute as something else which is not the same product or service of that the core product or service, the business, which is able to do the same job for the customer, right? So in this case, to make it very simple for us to understand, a landline phone does what an iPhone does, a part of it, which is the capacity to make a phone call, right? But there are other things that an iPhone is able to do that there are other substitute products that might be able to do. But what Apple and iPhone is able to do is to bring it all together, right, in one iPhone, right? So you can safely say that the threat of substituting or something else doing everything that an iPhone is able to do is relatively low. Okay, so let's talk about the buyer power, right? The buyer power is what power your customers, your consumers have. So for Apple, the buyers are you. All you Mac users here are buyers of Apple products, right? So what do you think, what power do you have to go to a different competitor of Apple? Yeah?
I mean, the buyer power is pretty low because we have a high cost to change.
Why is it a high cost to change?
Because if you have like an iPhone
Yeah.
or a Mac, that's like pretty expensive compared to other competitors.
Yeah.
So the buyer power compared in respect to Apple is pretty low because you have like a high cost to change.
Yeah, high cost to change because you've already invested a certain amount to use Apple. And the good thing, and that's again a strategic choice to create sort of lower buyer power by Apple, is to make sure that they have an ecosystem of products that run on the same platform, right? So you're more than likely, if you are a Mac user, you would be an iPhone user, and you'd have an iPad too, and so on and so forth. So everything, so all your products products are compatible with each other, and the more you do that, the more they lock you in. The lower your power becomes, and the higher Apple's power is as a producer or a business, right? So you get the hint. So yeah, the buyer power for you as an Apple consumer is probably lower than you would like, because more often than not, clearly, if you're a loyal Apple user, you would hesitate before you change sort of quickly. Let's talk about the supplier power. So if you're a supplier to Apple, how much power do you have? Who are Apple suppliers? Who might be supplying to Apple? And what might they be supplying?
Materials, which the phones are made of.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So where do you think many of those manufacturers come from? Sorry? From, in general, you want to keep your supply chain costs as low as possible. So more often than not, we see that a lot of the manufacturing happens in low-wage countries, China, and Taiwan, and all of this. It's generally where a lot of the semiconductor manufacturing, for example, happens. What is the power that these suppliers have? Probably not very high. So because the technology they produce is useful because Apple and people like Apple buy it, right? So otherwise, what they have is not more powerful than what Apple is able to do with the raw materials that they produce. So you get an idea of all of this. So let's talk about the most important thing. So as a result of all these forces, what happens to competitive rivalry? How competitive is the market that Apple operates in? Do they have many competitors?
No.
Who said no? Yeah, but why?
I mean, they do, but the difference between Apple and other phone companies.
Yeah, that's coming from a clear Apple loyalist. So yeah, you're right. So that's the strategy of Apple. So clearly they have people thinking that they don't function in a competitive industry, but they do. They do. The industry that Apple operates is extremely competitive. There are many players in the market, and Samsung is giving Apple now a real run for their money. They're playing the same game that Apple is playing. If you think about it, where Samsung was, it would be very interesting to follow what Samsung has already done and to see what they're going to do, because you can clearly see how they've moved in sort of being the laggard, but clearly a very, very close competitor for Apple today. So that's a bit of an industry Porter's five force analysis on Apple. And you would do something similar. So the idea is to think about each of those five forces and think about whether the intensity of that force or degree of that force is high or low for the industry that the business operates in. So that was all about external analysis, right? So then now we move to internal analysis. So internal analysis is you're thinking about internally, you as an organization. So clearly it's important to understand what's happening, external forces, the competitive forces, the industry forces, and the macro environmental forces. But what's also important is for you to build the resources and the competencies and use those resources and competencies in a way that you're able to develop a sustainable competitive advantage, right? So the framework or the theoretical perspective that's useful for you to do this aspect of the analysis is known as the resource-based view, right? So here you see Jay Barney. He's the one who came up with this theory and in 1991 and stands true today as a generic strategy theory, right? And this theory asserts that sustainable competitive advantage and superior performance of an organization is attained by the distinctiveness of their resources and capabilities. And we talked a little bit about what those resources might be. But broadly, Jay Barney says that that what Michael Porter and others are talking about, that external stuff is important, but what's most important for unique strategy and sustainable competitive advantage is what you build as your core resources and capabilities, and how distinctive are they. So a test to check about the distinctiveness of your resources and competencies and capabilities is this VRIO framework, right? So for four things, it's like a test to check if your assets and your resources have the potential to deliver a sustainable competitive advantage. The first thing is your resource valuable? All right. The second, so this flow chart is kind of useful to think about this linkage, right? So is your resource valuable? If it is, then yes, you have the potential to go toward developing a competitive advantage. But if what you have as a resource is not valuable, which means it doesn't have the potential to solve a real customer problem and fill a real gap in the market and create real value for real people, real customers, then there's no way that you can develop competitive advantage from a strategic perspective ever, right? So if you do, then good. Then the next test is to check if your resources, your core resources, whether it's technology or human resource or whatever it is rare, right? Is it something that sets you apart from your rivals? If it is, then you're moving further towards the potential to develop sustainable competitive advantage. But if you don't, then all you can attain, Jay Barney says, is competitive parity, which means that you can be like anyone else, but you're not really going to have the potential from a strategic perspective to be distinctive in your industry or for your market. The third test is inimitability, which is essentially about how difficult is it for competitors or for new entrants into your market to copy and do exactly what you do in the same way that you do it, right? So if it's harder for them to copy and do exactly what you do, then the higher are your chances of developing sustainable or distinctive competitive advantage. But if that's not the case, and the threat of new entrants is fairly high for the industry and for your market, then what you can attain is temporary competitive advantage, right? And to attain sustainable competitive advantage, you need to do more, just like Kodak needed to do more, right? And the last aspect is, are you organized to capture value? So it's important that you have all of these, the resources, but you also need to have the clear activities, structures, and processes to be able to deliver this value in a sustainable way, right? So clearly, if you follow, this is another way of thinking about this analysis, right? So it's about thinking about the VRIO model. Is the key resource valuable? Is it rare? Is it difficult to imitate? And do you have, or how have you organized your resources and your activities to keep creating and delivering that value? Okay, now there is an extension of the resource-based view. So came along David Tees, and that's him. He actually began to observe examples such as Kodak, who we talked about at the outset. He observed that many firms fail to sustain their performance because there are changes in the market, so there are changes in the technology. So Kodak is a classic example of a successful player, but could not keep up with that shift in the technology of people moving from traditional film to online technologies or digital film, right? So what David Tees then said, and that's a theory called dynamic capabilities, is what matters is not just having the resources and capabilities, as Jay Barney said in the the resource-based view, but it is to have the capabilities to, over time, change those operational capabilities and resources itself. So it's really about being agile enough to be able to evolve your capabilities so that they're constantly keeping up with the changing times. So it's the capacity of an organization to renew or recreate resources and capabilities to meet the needs of changing environment, right? Okay. So clearly there are three key processes for dynamic capabilities. The first one is sensing, the second one is seizing, and the third one is reconfiguring, right? Sensing capabilities is about the capability of an organization to sense opportunities in the environment. So the capacity to constantly scan and explore new opportunities and technologies. So traditional functions such as R&D, market research, and so on and so forth are meant to do that. The second dynamic capability process is seizing. So it's not enough if you just sense opportunities, but you need to be able to have a way as a business to do something about it, to seize, to invest in resources. So Kodak, for example, may have sensed the capabilities when they invented the new digital camera, but they seized the capability by investing in the technology that's required to actually create a new product line of digital cameras. Reconfiguring capabilities then are your capacity to constantly renew and reconfigure your resources and competencies and sort of do that over time. So to reconfigure your internal processes with changing times. Probably where Kodak failed, right? So they probably sensed, they probably seized, but they were not able to constantly transform themselves or reconfigure themselves and do what is necessary for that. So I'm going to let you have a look at this in your own time, but just with some of those exemplars, it gives you an idea of how dynamic capabilities works or functions. Let's take the example of Apple, because we've been talking about it today as an example. So clearly over here you can see Apple is an exemplar of design capabilities, something that you guys talked about. So what sets Apple apart for you? It's the design. It's the way the product is designed. It's the balance between the design and the functionality, right? So that's what sets Apple apart from their competitors. That is their source of their sustainable competitive advantage. So design capability is very important for Apple to be Apple and to be successful, right? So the function of dynamic capabilities then for Apple is to act on their design capabilities over time. So to make sure that what they're designing is keeping up with the changing trends and the changing consumer needs and so on and so forth. So that decides how the different versions of a Mac or an iPhone are. So what is the difference between an iPhone X and an iPhone 4, for example? You can see how their design capabilities have been improving, even incrementally and even radically, where they come up with an iPad for the first time when they already had an iPhone. So clearly there's design capabilities in radical innovation as well. Okay, let's see how dynamic capabilities may have functions. So that is the first ever cellular phone, right? So that was Motorola, right? How many of you have used this or have seen this? A few of you here, yeah? 3210, 3310, yeah. So classic, probably antique now, but when it came out, it was the phone in the smartphone industry, in the cellular phone industry. And why might that be the case? What was different about 3210 or a 3310 of Nokia? Victor?
The obvious difference in size.
Yeah, it was smaller. It was smaller, it was easier to use, it was easier to hold, and that was enough of design and functionality for at that point in time. All right, and then came along the smartphone. Right, we all use a smartphone. So what differentiates a smartphone from a sleek mobile phone? What is the USP of a smartphone? How would you pitch a smartphone versus a normal mobile cellular phone?
Internet connectivity.
Yeah, the internet connectivity, and through that you get other functionalities. So the apps, the mobile apps, and so on and so forth. So clearly you can do more than just calling through a cellular network using this. So you can see how dynamic capabilities have helped or not helped in some cases certain organizations over time. So in the mid-80s to the late 90s, the ones, the sort of the key players in the market were Ericsson and Motorola. The product that they came up with, which innovated, it was the mobile phone, right? So they came up with the first mobile phone. So clearly there was a need, they sensed the need for mobile phones, they seized the opportunity to create, to design a new mobile phone, and they invested in the resources required for it. And then the late 90s to 2000 came along Nokia. So clearly their USP was they're a mobile phone with improved design and functionality, right? That was different and unique at that point in time. So clearly they sensed the need for a mobile phone with improved design and functionality, and they invested, they seized that opportunity. And then late 2000s came along Apple, and what is their USP? They developed and designed mobile phones, so smartphones with perfected design functionality and a very, very well-designed user interface, right? So that sets Apple apart and probably sort of started spelling the decline of the Nokia, because they were not able to keep up with what Apple was able to do, and now Samsung is catching up in the smartphone market as well. So gives you a little bit of sense of how some players who were great innovators in the same industry were not able to keep up with changing trends. So very quickly, some strategic, this is useful. So this is work by Gary Pisano, the reading that you guys looked at today. But this is a key takeaway from this reading. So if you want to, as an organization, want to think about your innovation strategy, right? How you want to innovate, what type of innovation do you want to, then this is one way for you to think about it. You think about the degree of investment in technical competencies or technology versus your investment in business model changes, right? Let's take a couple of examples. Then again, you can look at it in your time and you will understand in the context of the reading as well. So it is, the first thing to take away is that it is not essential all the time for you to have the most radically new technology and the radically new business model. It's awesome if you do, because that's what makes some players come up with architectural innovation. So clearly, think about the new pharmaceutical companies. So clearly, the way that they have to innovate is by having high technology. Right, so investment in high scientific technology, but also if they come up with personalized medicines or ways in which they're able to get across these two unused markets and just to cure rare diseases. So it's really about coming up with a new business model as well. So clearly, if you have to become a Kodak from a traditional film to a digital film technology, you need to invest in new technology and also come up with new business models to be able to serve, create, and capture value from it. But on the other end of the spectrum, you can innovate without a radically new technology or a business model. Think about what iPhone does. An iPhone, from an iPhone 4 to an iPhone 5 to a 5S to a 6 to a 10, and so on and so forth. So many of the times we tend to believe that a great innovator has to be a radical or disruptive innovator, an architectural innovator. It doesn't have to be so. And you'd be surprised how much of the revenue that companies such as Apple earn, or a BMW for that matter, through their different car series, they earn a lot of their revenue. Their core revenue comes from incremental innovation, by just constantly being able to, in a routine way, develop better innovations, which doesn't necessarily call for investments in new technologies or new business models. But sometimes in a biotechnology company clearly needs to invest in new technologies if they want to come up with a radical innovation, as would aircraft manufacturers if they were producing jet engines and so on. Or on the other end of the spectrum, there might be some companies who are classic innovators, but they don't necessarily need the most breakthrough technology, but what they have is a great business model. And we've discussed plenty of examples of these kind of companies, the Airbnbs, the Uber, and so on, are classic examples of organizations that differentiate themselves and develop a sustainable competitive advantage, not because they have the best technology or a breakthrough technology or a product, but because they found a new way of developing, delivering a service to the same market, so to speak. So that's what Uber did. They've disrupted the taxi industry. Okay, so we're going to spend the next 5 minutes. This was the main crux of what we had to go through today. And the rest of it we're going to go through very quickly. But what's important is whatever we've talked about until now is important for the strategic analysis that you will engage in for your first assignment as well as your group project. So going forward, you will be using these frameworks a lot more, so the tutorials will be an opportunity for you to engage in this even more. So based on the strategy, and we talked about strategy frameworks until now, that throughout the building blocks that you also bear in mind, and you would use these more for your assignment 3 than for assignment 1 and 2, right? So you have to make choices as organizations to the actual structure of your business. And you also have to make choices to the processes or activities that you conduct. And these have an impact on how you implement innovation, right? So by structure, we're talking about the actual physical structure, like the design and layout of an organization, but we're also talking about the organizational structure, the hierarchy in the organization, and so on and so forth. So talking first about hierarchy and the structure of an organization in this sense, the two aspects you can think about where research has shown that to be more innovative, you need to not be a very bureaucratic organization. Over time, organizations, the bigger they get, the more corporate they get, the more bureaucratic they get. But research shows, and we see a lot of new innovators such as the Googles and the Apples of the world, thinking in what is known as post-bureaucratic terms. And also organizations going beyond a structured, top-down hierarchical way to have more self-managed teams and more empowered teams. So these things stimulate creativity and hence innovation. So by post-bureaucracy, we mean that a bureaucratic organization clearly is very hierarchical, has very strict rules and standards, very strict employment contract between the employer and the employee. But post-bureaucracy is all about flat hierarchies, open collaboration. It's a decentralized organization. So clearly having more self-managed teams, more open ways of sharing. A lot of organizations today use these purely because it stimulates creativity. It fosters innovation in their organization, right? So an example of which is W.L. Gore. I mean, they were among the first ones to try and come up with not a top-down hierarchical structure where there's a boss and there are so many employees, but they have what is known as a flat lattice organizational model, although they're a manufacturing player. And this is important because in some industries, because of efficiency and manufacturing, in manufacturing, it's important that you have efficiency. You need to have very clear standard systems and processes. But W.L. Gore, even being a manufacturer, came up with a new way of doing that, flat lattice organizational models, small plants. They call everybody associates, not employees. Bosses are not bosses, they're sponsors, they're enablers or facilitators. They have a very diffuse, decentralized model, even for doing R&D, right? So you can think about, I spoke to someone who's doing HR today. So clearly, all these sort of new world post-bureaucratic, collaborative human resource practices practices have an impact on the outcome of innovation and creativity that you can produce from your team. So here we have a bossless organization. This is really taking it to other end of the spectrum. Valve is a US-based sort of video game developer. And what sets them apart, and they still do that, they started off with traditional hierarchy, but today what they have is they're completely bossless, and they completely don't have hierarchies. And when you read this a little bit later, you can just look them up online. They have a completely non-hierarchical organization, and so this is the handbook for their new employees. It says that if you're a fearless adventurer in knowing what to do when no one's there telling you what to do. So essentially there's no, the employee involved sort of chooses what he or she wants to do, manages his or her sort of goals and key performance indicators. It's a very, very emergent, very loose structure, but it works for them. So you must look them up to understand a radically different way in which you can create organizational hierarchies and structures around which you can actually think about doing innovative stuff, all right? So that's their organizational chart, so created by employees themselves. So you can see that this is the way they look at their organizational hierarchy. So it's everyone's at the same level and everyone's working together. And that's all. It's very plain and simple. Just roll up your sleeves and get some work done. Right. So this is another way to look at layout structures, is the physical layout. And an example of that is Google. We'll be talking a lot more about this in today's tutorial, and this is going to be fun to really try and touch and feel how Google designs its physical layouts in a way that they can actually make their organization more creative. And we all know Google is the most is creative. It's made the creativity of their workforce and the engagement of their workforce is the key driver for the innovative outcomes that it comes up with. So famously, a researcher who researched Google says their offices are designed as creative playgrounds, and Google is the kind of place where the kind of people would work even for free. So that's the sort of workplace engagement that they are able to create, the field they're able to create purely in the way that they've been able to design their offices for better workflow, better engagement from the workforce. We'll be unpacking this a lot more in today's tutorial. But very quickly, to think about what we mean by a process for innovation. It's really about trying to understand the approach, the activities, that how we approach innovation on a day-to-day basis and how we actually do it. So a theory that you can bear in mind here is known as ambidexterity. So research says that to encourage and promote innovation, organizations need to be ambidextrous, which means that they need to have the capacity to explore and exploit at the same time. So they come up with routines and processes that seek the balance between exploring and exploiting. So think of exploring as what we've been terming as creating value. It's really about seeking opportunities. It's blue ocean, blank canvas, pursuing new ideas. The idea is not to make money, but to think about ways of how we can come up with the next new thing. It's about seeking new opportunities to come up with a new product, new service, to fulfill a new unfulfilled need in the market. However, that's not enough. To capture some value from it, so sensing is important, but to seize an opportunity, you need to do something internally. You need to develop some resources, you need to invest in some competencies and capabilities, set up your organization structures, design your offices, do stuff, create your HR practices around it. You need to do stuff in order to be able to exploit that opportunity, right? So it's really about thinking about how, as an organization, you can do both at the same time. There's clearly tensions between exploring and exploiting, but you need to have clear processes so you're able to do that. So again, something that you'll be engaging with if you do a different subject that I teach, known as Innovation Lab. It's about entrepreneurial creativity innovation. We talk about how we can facilitate creative processes through design thinking and lean startup. So clearly using human-centric collaboration, collaborative, action-oriented approaches to creating innovation. So you don't need to understand this in too much detail, but when you read through this on your own, you will get an idea of what this process is about. It's really about starting with the customer, starting with the user, understanding what the real problems of users are, starting with the frustrations and the pain points that users seem to face, to identify some unfulfilled gap or need in the market, and then using a creative process to be able to brainstorm and come up with ideas to solve those problems. So define a problem and then creatively brainstorm to ideate multiple ways of solving that problem. And each of those ideation processes can lead to a new business concept or a new entrepreneurial idea, which you then prototype, rapid prototyping, and eventually testing to create new business models. All right. So Google, again, a company, Apple, Google, IBM, all organizations, high innovators in the world, use design thinking. So you can think about what they do as a strategy, we are able to see that, but how they do it internally as an organization is to have a very clear process and approach of organizing innovation internally. Google does that to develop better workplace experiences. Again, we'll unpack that in today's tutorial. All right, that brings us to the end of organizing and managing innovation. 3 building blocks: strategy, structure, process. Strategy is important. Start with strategy because that's your long-term idea of how you want to do, what innovation you want to do, and how you want to be thinking about doing it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's class. Today's tutorial will help you unpack this and apply this a little bit better.